So we are going over one of the hadith from the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi. This week we are on hadith 30. These lectures are taken from Hussein Kaman. It's available on his podcast.
Yeah.
So inshallah, so we'll start today at hadith 30 عن أبي ثعلبة الخشني جرثوم بن ناشر رضي الله تعالى عنه عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن الله تعالى فرض فرائض فلا تضيعوها وحد حدود فلا تعتدوها وحرم أشياء فلا تنتهكوها وسكت عن أشياء رحمة لكم غير نسيان فلا تبحثوا عنها. This was narrated by Dar Qutni, and so we will read the translation right now, inshallah. And so this narration was narrated by Sahabi we have also not come across, Ibn Tha'laba. So it was on Abi Tha'laba al-Khushani. It's a new Sahabi. And it goes as follows. So on the authority of Abi Tha'laba al-Khushani, Jarthuma ibn Nashir, may Allah be pleased with him, he said that the Messenger of Allah ﷺ said, Verily Allah, the Almighty, has prescribed the obligatory deeds, so do not neglect them. And He has set certain limits, so do not go beyond them. And He has forbidden certain things, so do not indulge in them. And He has said nothing about certain things as an act of mercy to you, not out of forgetfulness, so do not go inquiring into these. Related by Dar Qutni and others. And Imam Nawawi said that this is a fine hadith, a hasan hadith. So we'll start with the narrator because we have not come across this narrator before. Abu Tha'laba al-Khushani. He was a Sahabi who was at the Bay'atul Ridwan, which is essentially where the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, when they were trying to do Umrah that first year, in the 6th year of Hijrah, they were not able to do Hijrah. And Uthman radiallahu anhu was inside of Mecca, and they thought that he was killed. There was rumors that Uthman was killed, and so they thought that they were going to have to do a battle. But they were in their clothes of ihram. They didn't have any weapons with them, and so the Prophet ﷺ took a bay'ah at that time to get the Muslims to see if they were ready for battle, despite them not having weapons or being armed to defend Uthman. And so that was known as Bay'atul Ridwan. It's like one of the kind of seminal moments in our history, and the people present at that are considered like to have a very high rank, and so he was one of the people who was at that bay'ah, or giving of allegiance. And he lived his life in Sham afterwards. After the Prophet ﷺ passed away, he moved to Sham. Many people say he lived in Homs, and there's many people that have narrated from him, and he has a few narrations that are pretty well known. And so, for example, like there's a narration from the Prophet ﷺ. He mentions that the people who are the closest and most beloved to him, to the Prophet ﷺ, are those with good character, and the people who are the farthest away are the people with bad character. That's a narration that he also narrates, and there's a few others. And so one thing that he was really known for was that he was known to really reflect on nature and just spend a lot of time in reflection. One thing he would do is sometimes he'd go out to the night sky and just look at the stars for a long period of time, and then come back home and just be in sujood for a very long time, just thanking Allah and reflecting on the beauty of nature and the creation of Allah. So that's something he was very well known for. And when they got to Sham, he was known to lead one of the first prayers, and one of the first prayers in Homs, the city of Homs. It's a major city in Sham, even to this day. And one of the first prayers led there was actually inside of a church, and he led that prayer. And so he was on the forefront there, and he also did not partake in any of the fitan. So there's like some issues that took place between Muawiyah and Ali. May Allah be pleased with them both. And he didn't partake in any of those issues that happened during that time. He passed away in the 75th year of Hijrah. And he passed away in sujood. He used to make dua. He passed away in a very special state, in a state of peace. He asked Allah to make his passing very easy. And he passed away in the sujood. And that was narrated, or that was noted about him. And it's actually very interesting. When he died in sujood, his family didn't know that he had passed away. His daughter asked, where is my father? And his mother, his wife said, the mother of the daughter, said that he's just praying over there. And she went, he said he's been in there for a long time. So she tried calling him, he didn't respond. She tried taking him in sujood, and that's when they found out that he had passed away. And so this hadith, we'll start with a different kind of take on this. We're going to start with its authenticity. And so all the hadith we've ever gone over so far are unanimously sahih, right? They're in like the sahih books that we've come across. This is one of the very few hadiths, maybe one of the only hadiths in this collection that there's been some discussion on its authenticity. I think it's worth maybe just getting into it a little bit, just to kind of give us an idea of what that even means. Like, what does the sahih mean? What does da'if mean? How do these things get narrated? And so some people have said that this is actually a weaker narration. And the reason for its weakness is that there is a cut or a cut in the chain, essentially. So any hadith that we give, there's always a chain that comes with it, a chain of narrators. And the narrators come from the Prophet ﷺ, and then it gets passed to a sahabi. The sahabi passes it to a tabi'i, which means someone after the sahabi. And then a tabi'i, which means the third generation. So from a sahabi, tabi'i, and then there's many generations afterwards. And this chain goes on until it either gets recorded in a book authentically, or it gets transmitted live in the hearts of people who have memorized these chains. And in our tradition, we have these hadith that get memorized both ways, both in books and through the hearts of people that memorize these chains in the hadith. The isnad is the name of the chain. Matan means the content of the hadith itself. And so what's happening here is some people have said that there is a cut in the chain, that the person who narrates on the sahabi, so basically the person who narrates, it's like the Prophet ﷺ, the sahabi, and then someone narrates from the sahabi, right? So someone has mentioned that the person who narrated in this chain actually never met the sahabi. And so that means there's a third, like there's a person in between that isn't mentioned. And if you don't know who that is, then it makes the whole chain weak, because you can't essentially like criticize the narrator. So when they say a narrator is a strong, there's like three things really that are part of the hadith being strong. It's the chain can't have any break in it. And then the narrators, each narrator in the chain has to be have dabt and adala. Adala is kind of good integrity, good character. And then dabt is like their good, essentially, like trustworthiness. So they have to have good memory, for example. They have to have trustworthy. They can't have ever lied or cheated or been convicted of something. So all those things go into how you grade a chain, at a very top level. And so some people have mentioned that there's a cut in the chain. That's one reason. And then some other people have mentioned that this might be mawquf, which means that it's something that comes from Abu Thalaba, but he didn't get it from the Prophet ﷺ. It was just his own saying, his own wisdom he was sharing with people. It's not actually a hadith. So those are two things that people have criticized this hadith for. But what's interesting is other people like Hafid Abu Bakr, he's a great scholar of hadith. He mentioned that this is actually a Hasan hadith. It's a fine hadith. It's a good hadith. It's sahih. And Imam Nawawi also brings it in the same light. And the reason for that is because, first of all, there's other narrations that mention the same thing. There's like other chains that it goes through. And then the other thing is that there's other Sahaba that have narrated almost the exact same hadith, just like with slightly different wording. And so the meaning of it comes from the Prophet ﷺ authentically. It's just this one chain might have some criticism about it. But Abu Darda, a different Sahabi, and Salman al-Farsi both mention hadith that are very similar to this. And we've covered one before, that the halal bayyin wal haram bayyin, that the halal is clear and the haram is clear. And what this is really adding here is that there's some things that Allah purposely did not mention. So we'll get into that inshallah. So that's kind of just like an overview of maybe some hadith that we don't get much exposure to. And so the idea of this hadith, it mentions that Allah has told us to, commanded us to do certain things and commanded us to avoid certain things, and that some things He stayed silent on out of mercy and not out of forgetfulness. And so some people have said that this hadith is actually one of the most summative hadiths of Islam, that it's like in just a few, like in one line essentially, it summarizes the very basic concepts of fiqh, like the legality in Islam, and like how you deal with ethics and morality in Islam. And so it gives us a very good guideline on how to break things down. And so what was interesting here is that Mufti Kamani in his lecture, he got into some of the things about like haram and halal and like the different things, that the way you break it down. But the important thing that I think to take away is not to get caught up in the legal language. A lot of times we get caught up like, oh, this thing's farad, this thing's haram, and this thing's makruh. And the real idea of this hadith, like the spirit of this hadith, what it's trying to convey, is not that there's like these discrete legal categories and we have to be sure to follow like what's haram, and if it's not haram then it's fine to do. It's like about like Allah's trying to get us to avoid certain things, so just do your best to avoid it. Like because to get something to the level of haram, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, to get something to the level of haram is very difficult. It's like very stringent means to get something to haram. So there's actually very few things in our religion that are actually haram. But there's still some things that are disliked, that are frowned upon, looked down upon. And that doesn't mean that we should take that lightly. We should try to take those things seriously and do our best to avoid those things. And on the flip side also, there's some things that are not farad, right? Like we have the 5 daily prayers that we know that are part of the faith, that are farad. They're like obligatory upon us as Muslims. But then there's also a lot of extra deeds that we can be doing that we call nawafil, extra things. We call them sunnahs, things that the Prophet ﷺ did himself. And we try to follow those examples. So just because someone says something's a sunnah, for example, we shouldn't take that lightly. Be like, oh yeah, it's fine, like it's just a sunnah. We should really take that seriously. This hadith is really trying to tell us we should really try to follow that as much as possible. And so the idea is like the faith is not trying to overburden us by making everything obligatory and everything absolutely prohibited. There's a lot of in between, but we should try to do our best to maximize what is good. And that's the best way to develop our hearts. Like if we're always trying to follow the minimum, then we're never going to really develop spiritually. And so that's kind of like the main takeaway for that. And what's interesting also, coming back to this idea that haram and halal, like it's very difficult to kind of prove these things. Imam Malik himself, he said that his teachers, when people would ask them if this was haram or halal, like they would ask him for these opinions, they would say that like, I dislike this. They would kind of give a personal thing, like from what I understand about the faith, like I don't really like think that you should do this. But they would really shy away from saying something was haram outright, because again, it's very difficult to prove and it makes it a burden for certain people. And the faith is not about making things burdenful. And so that's like kind of a lesson for us, is that if people come to us and ask us for opinions, like unless you are confident and you have a source and like you've really looked into it yourself, try not to make things so black and white, haram, halal. Like there's a lot of things in between, and kind of give people that leeway. Which is not to say it make things easy for people, but just like the term halal has a lot in it, and we take it lightly sometimes. And so, yeah, avoiding the doubtful when it comes to food, and it comes to our clothes, our income, these are all important parts of this hadith, is avoiding what's doubtful, not just what's outright haram. And then it mentions here, like, do the good deeds and don't waste it. And what it mentions is, like, don't wasting your deeds. And there's a lot of ways you can waste your deeds. And it's like by doing them but not doing them properly, or not giving your full heart to them, kind of the more effort you're going to put into your deed and the more focus you're going to give your deeds, the more you're going to get out of them. And like a good point that Imam Kamani mentioned, and I feel shy to mention because I'm very far from this myself, but like especially in Salah, like he was mentioning how like to do Salah properly, there's like really 2 components. It's like the proper focus in the Salah and then doing it on time. And so if we're able to do these, the more we're able to pay attention to those components, the better each Salah is going to be. And the Salah is going to be like, it's going to either be on our behalf or against us in the Day of Judgment, depending on how much attention we give it. So inshallah, may Allah grant us, like we're here in the masjid, may Allah allow us to be the people who, Salah beseeches for us, not against us, inshallah. Ameen. And then the other thing he mentions here is obviously stay within the limits of, like Allah has set limits, so don't surpass them, don't violate these limits. And what's interesting here is that, like we mentioned before, there's very few things that are actually haram in the deen. There's a lot more things that are halal. Like everything by default is essentially halal until proven otherwise. And so what's interesting in the Quran that the Mufti talks about, that was a really good point, is that in the Quran when it mentions a lot of things that are haram, that are actually haram, it'll always mention something or almost always mention something that's halal with it. So like, you don't eat like this kinds of meat, but eat these kinds of meat, for example. Like you can't talk to interact with the opposite gender in this way, but make sure that you interact in this way. And so it always kind of gives you like, this is the haram way, but then there's also an alternative, which is a good thing for us to learn, is like if there is something that's like prohibited, not to make the deen seem like it's like closing us in a box, but to give people also paths. Like this might be haram, but there's a million other ways that you can be doing what you're trying to achieve. And so yeah, I think that kind of covers that pretty well. And then this issue about remaining silent in the end of the hadith that mentions that Allah has purposefully not mentioned, this is a very interesting point, that Allah has purposefully not mentioned many issues as a mercy, not out of forgetfulness. Allah did not forget to mention these issues to us. And then the Prophet ﷺ says, do not go about inquiring into them. And so that brings up a good point, is the religion, again, here trying to limit us from asking questions, or is seeking knowledge about our faith? And again, the answer is absolutely not. Some people have mentioned that this is specifically mentioning the context of the Prophet ﷺ himself. Because during the Prophet ﷺ's time, if people asked about the little nitty-gritty details of everything, and there was revelation actively happen, then Allah's going to send down a verse or some indication to the Prophet ﷺ whether something's haram and halal, and everything becomes haram at that point, makes the thing very difficult. A very good example happened in an earlier hadith we mentioned. where a man asked, like, the Prophet was mentioning Hajj, and someone asked, like, do we have to do Hajj every year? And the Prophet got so angry, because imagine if Allah revealed the answer was yes. Like, what's going to happen to people who were very far away and Hajj was very difficult or expensive for them, and yet you just made Hajj farad for every single year? It's like, for those kinds of things, like, because the revelation is actively being brought down at that time, it was very dangerous for them. So the Prophet is talking to them specifically. And then also for us, the lesson to take away from this is that, it's not to not ask questions about the faith. You should always, if you're not clear about something, always ask someone of authority, someone who's studied, someone who's qualified. So never be shy of any question. But the idea is, like, sometimes you'll get like an opinion and you feel like, oh no, this should be haram. So you're going to keep asking until you finally find some way to make something haram on people, and then you're going to spread that as soon as you find it's haram. And that's kind of what this is talking about, is not making things difficult for people, not trying to like search for an example where it's finally going to be haram. That's not the point of the deen. It's not to make it difficult on people. It's just kind of, seek counsel and ask questions when you have them, but don't kind of go into the nitty-gritty details that we sometimes fall into. And so again, like the halal and the haram, they're both mostly, for the most part, clear. And don't put yourself in situations where it's like there's unnecessary doubt, and then like find those little details. So that's kind of the point of this hadith. That's a little bit of an overview of kind of usul hadith, like what makes hadith, how you grade hadith. Inshallah, people found that beneficial. Jazakallah khair for your time. See you next week, inshallah.